Once upon a time, there lived a poor woodcutter near a quiet forest. Every day, he worked hard cutting wood and selling it in the market to earn money for his family. He was poor, but he was honest and kind. One day, while cutting a tree near a river, his axe suddenly slipped from his hands and fell into the deep water. The woodcutter was shocked and very sad. That axe was his only source of income. He sat by the river and started crying helplessly. Suddenly, a magical fairy appeared. She asked the woodcutter why he was crying. The woodcutter politely told her the truth about losing his axe. The fairy decided to test his honesty. She went into the river and came out with a golden axe. "Is this your axe?" she asked. The woodcutter replied, "No, this is not mine." Then the fairy brought out a silver axe and asked the same question. Again, the woodcutter answered honestly, "No, this is not mine." Finally, the fairy brought out his old iron axe. The woodcutter smiled with joy and said, "Yes. This is my axe." The fairy was very pleased with his honesty. As a reward, she gave him all 3 axes, the iron, silver, and golden ones. The woodcutter thanked her and returned home happily. From that day on, he lived a better life. The woodcutter walked deeper into the forest, carrying his axe on his shoulder. The morning was quiet, and the sound of birds filled the air. He chose a tall tree near the river and began cutting it with full effort. Suddenly, his hand slipped. The axe flew out of his grip and fell straight into the deep river with a loud splash. The woodcutter froze in shock. He ran to the edge of the river and looked into the water, but the axe was gone. His face turned pale. That axe was the only tool he owned. Without it, he could not cut wood, and without work, he could not earn money for food. Slowly, he sat down beside the river, feeling helpless and broken. Tears rolled down his face as he thought about his family and their daily needs. He tried to reach into the water, but the river was too deep and dangerous. There was no way to get the axe back. The forest, once peaceful, now felt silent and heavy. The woodcutter bowed his head and began to cry, not blaming anyone, but accepting his loss with honesty and patience. At that moment, the water started to glow softly. As the woodcutter sat by the river, crying quietly, the water suddenly began to shine with a soft golden light. He looked up in surprise. Slowly, a beautiful fairy rose from the river, glowing like sunlight. The woodcutter stood up in fear and respect. The fairy smiled gently and asked, "Why are you crying, kind man?" With folded hands, the woodcutter replied honestly. He told her how his axe had fallen into the river and how it was his only way to earn money for his family. He did not ask for help, nor did he complain about his fate. The fairy listened carefully. She could see the truth in his eyes and kindness in his words. To test his honesty, she decided to help him in a special way. She said softly, "Do not worry. I will try to help you." The fairy then dived into the deep river. The woodcutter watched silently, hoping but not expecting anything. Moments later, the fairy came out of the water holding a shining golden axe. She looked at the woodcutter and asked, "Is this your axe?" The woodcutter shook his head and replied calmly, "No, this is not my axe." The fairy smiled, knowing the test had begun. The fairy went back into the river once again. The water sparkled as she disappeared beneath the surface. After a few moments, she came back holding a silver axe. She looked at the woodcutter and asked kindly, "Is this your axe?" The woodcutter carefully looked at the shining silver axe. For a moment, he thought about his poor life, but he did not lie. He shook his head and said, "No, this is not my axe." The fairy nodded with a gentle smile. She then dived into the river for the 3rd time. When she returned, she was holding an old iron axe covered with rust. The woodcutter's face lit up with happiness. "Yes. This is my axe," he said with joy. The fairy was very pleased. She could see that the woodcutter was truly honest and not greedy. The fairy went back into the river once again. The water sparkled as she disappeared beneath the surface. After a few moments, she came back holding a silver axe. She looked at the woodcutter and asked kindly, "Is this your axe?" The woodcutter carefully looked at the shining silver axe. For a moment, he thought about his poor life, but he did not lie. He shook his head and said, "No, this is not my axe." The fairy nodded with a gentle smile. She then dived into the river for the third time. When she returned, she was holding an old iron axe covered with rust. The woodcutter's face lit up with happiness. "Yes. This is my axe," he said with joy. The fairy was very pleased. She could see that the woodcutter was truly honest and not greedy.